Accountability and ownership can sound like two terms that are somewhere between draconian and just downright punitive, but they're actually two very important elements to consider in the way in which you structure your organization. In fact, if you use these really carefully, you can end up deliberately creating an org structure that embraces a culture of empowerment and also sets up your leaders in your organization to be able to act with agency and autonomy, which gives them the ability to achieve some pretty amazing outcomes. Hi, I'm James, and this is Paved with Good Intentions. So accountability and ownership, they're two very related things, but they're actually quite different. The way I like to define this is that I think of ownership as something that exists at the team level. So a team owns something. They are responsible for designing, building, implementing, supporting, operating a product, a feature, a service. It's something that they own, right? It's something that is entirely and exclusively theirs, which is different to accountability, which is, to me, accountability is always something that you attribute to an individual, and it's always to one specific individual. And they're accountable for an outcome. And whereas ownership is a bit more of a permanent concept because you have this thing that the team is responsible for, could be in perpetuity or could be for the life of the product. Accountability tends to be either a temporary thing where that accountability notion exists for the lifetime of that objective until that objective is fulfilled, or it ends up being the sort of accountability that is a permanent thing because the criteria is the kind of thing that's never actually achieved. It's accountability for a particular ongoing task, for example, or a certain responsibility that comes down to that one individual. Well, let's first talk about ownership. So when you are thinking about how to structure your organization, ownership is key, and the most important element here to me is to frame the ownership around the business value drivers. There's lots and lots of different dimensions that you could use to define ownership. I've seen org charts drawn up over code bases, over functional elements of a business, over certain different parts of the product set. But these work insofar as you can define an org structure on paper along those lines, but what they're lacking is actually explaining what the value is that this team will provide to the business and therefore what their purpose for existing is. And that is really, really key because ultimately it's going to be this ownership, this sense of what the team owns, that's from which they will derive their identity. And from that, they're going to determine how to make sense of how they fit in the organization and how to drive more value for that organization. And because it's tied into their identity and how they see themselves and how the organization makes sense, it's from this that will stem their culture, their work ethic, and ultimately their craftsmanship. I think that's really important, especially in software engineering organizations or an engineering organization where you're trying to always balance quality versus scope versus delivery timeframe. The team has to be able to intrinsically understand what the value is they provide to the organization or how they provide that value, so that within themselves they can make the right trade-off calls around scope, delivery timeframe, quality, etc. It's a fundamental thing that really empowers that team to be able to make great choices on their own. After you deal with defining the business value drivers for a team and sort of shaping the different teams around owning a particular value driver, to me the second order constructs that then come into play are the separation of concerns and also dealing with any ambiguity. So separation of concerns means that each team, their ownership should be exclusive, and it should be easy for you or anyone in the business to explain and to understand why that team exists in the way it does. If you're creating teams where there's a lot of confusion about, how will that boundary line work, or how are they going to own that when this thing also owns this, then unfortunately the bad news is you've got more thinking to do, right? You've got to get to a point where the separation of concerns is so clear that anyone in the business, that you can easily give them a 5 or 10 second explanation and they just look at you and they get it, right? You've got to get it to that point where it makes that much sense. If you're dividing up team lines and you think it's pretty clever and it works, but you still got to then spend a 10 or 15 minute explanation on why you've done it that way, there's higher level problems you need to address there, unfortunately. because the communication to the business around what that ownership is going to be crucial to that ownership actually taking hold. Right? The rest of the business has to understand, almost without any explanation, right, almost intuitively, why it makes sense for that team to exist, to own what they do, and of course then naturally what value they're providing for the business. And then we've got accountability. And at Apple, we used to talk a lot about the directly responsible individual, or DRI, and that was sort of my first real inkling into just the sheer importance of assigning one person to be the accountable individual for an outcome. And it's always got to be one person. I've worked at plenty of places where, it's just it just happens that, an action item will come up and they'll say, Terrence and John will both own that. It's like, well, I'm sure Terry and John are the best people in the world, but no amount of good intentions will get away from the fact that ultimately a shared accountability is no accountability. Right? It's not down to skills or ability or workmanship or work ethic or anything like that. The plain fact of the matter is that a shared accountability is no accountability. You've got to assign accountability for an outcome to one single individual. Now that individual can go wild and delegate, accountability to, subtasks within a particular outcome that they are delivering, or different streams of work, whatever makes sense for them to be able to divide and conquer to reach the outcome that they've taken on responsibility for. But ultimately, even when you break it down into subtasks or into different streams of work and have sub-DRIs and you're going to do this piece of the puzzle, I'm going to do that piece of the puzzle, ultimately all of that has to still synthesize up into just one single directly responsible individual. And that directly responsible individual, they enter into a pact with the business. It's a bidirectional thing, and this is incredibly important, especially for senior leaders in the business to understand. It's a pact. The person who becomes that directly responsible individual, that accountable individual, they're taking on a pact where they are accepting the fact that the buck stops with them. If the project's a roaring success, awesome, that's on them. If the project fails, that's also on them, right? And the rewards and the recriminations that will come out for that rests with them. That's what happens when you become a directly responsible individual or accountable for something. Right? All the glory is there to be shared with your team, but so is all the risk. Right? That's what you're taking on. But the other side of this that's not nearly spoken to enough or adhered to enough is that the business also needs to enter into a pact with that individual that's taking on the responsibility, such that the business is granting them the agency, the authority, and the autonomy to get that task done. Okay, and this is where things get unraveled, especially in rapidly growing companies. The business and the senior leadership of the business must defer to the directly responsible individual and work with them, channel through them to get that outcome done. There is zero sense at all in defining a DRI and then working around them or going direct to the team to get information or subverting the course of whatever. It doesn't work, right? And it stops your organization scaling. It stops your people from learning and growing. And it introduces the kind of confusion and chaos that puts that outcome completely at risk. So that pact is super, super important and something that has to be sacred between the individual taking on the responsibility and the business granting the autonomy and the agency to get that job done. Also, another point around a rapidly growing organization is that there is going to be a lot of times, and in fact, the more the organization grows, the more this will become the norm, whereby there is a difference and a deliberate difference that you have to embrace between what you own and what you influence. Right? There will be things you own based on the team that you're in or the team that you manage or the org that you manage. But then there's going to be initiatives and outcomes that you become directly responsible for that you're going to influence through to completion, but that's going to require input from teams that are not in your org, that are not managed by you. And this is something that a lot of managers that are used to sort of just managing within their team and getting their function done, they struggle with this at first. And I think it's one of the great sort of learning tipping points for a manager going from being that first level manager to being ready to be a leader of leaders. Likewise for an individual contributor going from being a very competent senior or even principal level talent to being able to test their ability to have great cross-functional impact. Because there is a difference, and it's deliberate and it's intentional, and you've got to embrace it. There's a difference between what you own or the team that you're part of and what you can have influence over. In fact, the most successful and impactful and effective individuals in an organization typically have this ability to expand their sphere of influence way beyond the team that they're in. And that's the hallmark of success in a cross-functional environment. When you have the ability to become directly responsible for something that's not only within your own team or nearby your team, but involves effort from other teams, and you're able to coordinate that and get them on board with that and see that through to success, then that's a huge growth that you've gone through. And it's the kind of skill set that really takes you from being that leader to being a leader of leaders to ready to step up to start being an executive leader of an organization. Now, one other thing on just the concept of ownership in general. Ownership itself and the way we framed it here around owning business value or business value drivers can be very helpful as a bit of a litmus test or an acid test in testing out the validity or the strength of your business growth plans. So you hear about rules like, teams shouldn't be bigger than 6 or 8 people, or the most efficient span of control number, or Amazon has its 2 pizza size team rule. Whatever framework you adhere to, that there's a notion of roughly 6 to 8 people is the magic number of how big a team should be before the span of control gets too large. And when that happens, when you start getting teams that are at that number or over that number, you're faced with a dilemma of how do you then grow that team? And this is where I think framing the ownership of a team around those business value drivers is very powerful. Because when you look at that problem in isolation of a large team, how do you separate it? How do you do like a cellular division to split it into 2 and then have new manager and then the existing manager, etc. I think the instinctive first thing that we tend to do is we think about the lines of division that already exist within that team. Are there multiple code bases? Could we just divide those up and separate them between the teams? Is there a front end versus a back end? Is there a data element to this versus a code element, right? You look for those dimensions that already exist and try to drive differentiation across them. That will work on paper. You'll have no trouble at all glancing at a team and quickly saying, oh, that's easy. We'll just split them in 2, new manager here, they take on that, old manager stays there and takes on that. But hang on a sec. You haven't solved for what the value is of that team. I mean, it may well be that the team can't derive any business value without being the sum of all of its parts. And then you've got to start taking a really deeper introspective look at how that team operates, what are their activities, which of them are driving business value, which of them are supporting activities, and then you really start getting into the real meat of a business organizational structural exercise. Because it's got to be around those business value driving lines. Otherwise you end up with teams that they'll own something and they'll be clear about what their day-to-day activities are, but they won't have a sense of what value they derive. Therefore, they can't build up an identity that is aligned with the business goals and help the business achieve its growth. Before we go, I wanted to share with you some experiences that I've had in enacting organizational change. And look, hand on my heart, I can tell you that enacting org structure changes is one of the hardest things we have to do as managers and leaders in a business. And it's hard on the employees too, right? Don't discount the fact that for an individual contributor, having a change of manager is probably one of the most disruptive actions that can happen to them at work, and it also puts a huge dent in their psychological safety at work. Right? They're used to relying on this person to be their go-to person, the person that's got their interests in mind, and when you change that out from under them, it can be a really big deal to them. I think people that have been in higher levels of management or senior levels in a company for a while, they tend to lose the perspective of that, because I think as you move up the org chart, you become less and less dependent on your manager or who you're reporting to, and more of a partner and an ally with them. But for a lot of individual contributors, especially junior employees, you have to remember that this is going to be a big change for them. And so that means that there is, I think, 2 or 3 different things you need to take into account. First of all, to enact an org structure change takes a huge amount of trust. Your org has to trust you, and depending on how strongly you think they do trust you will depend upon how much time you take enacting this change. The more trust you have, the quicker you'll be able to move. But I'd caution that even the highest level of trust you think you've got and the most amount of confidence you've got in that level of trust you think you've got, you could well be wrong. And it's an exercise like this that can actually start to expose some real sort of latent problems or festering issues within the org. So bias for moving slowly. Over-communicate wherever possible, and depending on the nature of the org structure change, try to get the teams in the organization involved in the process. And here's one of sort of the really great challenges for you as a leader in the company. You probably know what you want the org structure to look like. You've spent time looking at the problems, you've defined what the value driving areas are, you've got a plan in mind, and you just want to see it happen, right? I've been there many times. The art in this is to make that idea something that the org can arrive at through largely their own thinking. And you do that by determining what are the guidelines, what are the governing principles, the first principles, the value drivers, all these things we've talked about in this episode. What are those things that you've determined, and how did you determine them? Because if you can define the guidelines for that decision-making process and impart that to your direct reports and to their teams, they'll be able to arrive at the same sort of conclusions and maybe even better conclusions. But then they'll own that solution and they'll own implementing it. And that is a fantastic outcome for them. Right? A completely top-down org chart that's just dictated to people never ends well. It'll be disruptive. People will not take good ownership over the plan typically, and it can be a bit of a trust-burning exercise between the individual contributors and the management in the team. So be careful, tread slowly, get the team involved as much as you can. And one last thing, don't conflate performance management and team restructuring and reorganization. I've been guilty of this before, and it's a terrible thing to do, and it feels convenient, and at the time it feels like, of course, it makes sense, we're restructuring, and this person wasn't effective there, so let's just, as part of this, move their team somewhere else, and then we can have that conversation with them as part of this restructure. Don't do that, okay? It looks easy and it feels easy, but the reason it feels easy is because you've kicked the can down the road, and you can. It feels acceptable to us on some level that, look, this is just part of a huge reorg, right? We're justifying what we're doing as it being a business process, a business reorganization, and that's not fair to that individual. Okay, if there's performance issues there, you need to be identifying them and having those conversations with them, those honest and difficult conversations with the employee, long before you think about restructuring their teams and limiting their influence or limiting their responsibility or even changing their responsibility in any way, right? So don't conflate the two. It's way too easy to do, and again, sometimes it feels right because we justify it as this is just a business restructure, etc., but it's not right for the individual. So business org structure. Try to take into account the business value drivers to shape ownership, and always assign accountability to one single individual, and make sure that you are entering into a real and honest pact with that individual such that they are willing to take on the responsibility, and you as the business and the senior leadership are willing to give them the agency and the autonomy to be successful in their role. Hi, I'm James, and this has been Paved with Good Intentions.